I thought I knew what rock bottom looked like, until I discovered it has a basement. It was 6:47 a.m. when my phone buzzed against the hospital parking lot dashboard, and I knew before answering that this call would shatter what remained of my carefully constructed life. "I'm sorry." Dr. Martinez's voice carried the weight of 1,000 prayers I'd never prayed. "But the tests confirm it's stage 4, and we're looking at maybe 6 months." Sarah's hand found mine in that sterile silence, her wedding ring catching the morning light like a promise we might not get to keep, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world kept spinning when mine had just stopped. By noon, I was walking out of Morrison & Associates carrying a cardboard box that held 15 years of my identity, the mahogany nameplate, the crystal award from our biggest client, the family photo that used to remind me why I worked 80-hour weeks, now mocking me with its frozen happiness. "Budget cuts," Henderson had said, not meeting my eyes, as if looking away could soften the betrayal of timing, as if corporate compassion meant delivering devastating news with downcast eyes and a firm handshake. The afternoon brought bankruptcy lawyers and medical bills that read like phone numbers, each zero another nail in the coffin of our American dream, our house, our children's college funds, everything we'd built becoming collateral damage in a war between cancer and capitalism. I called my best friend Marcus, the one who'd stood beside me at my wedding, who'd celebrated every promotion, every victory, every milestone that mattered, and listened to his phone ring 6 times before voicemail answered with its cheerful betrayal. "Hey, you've reached Marcus. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you." But we both knew he wouldn't. Not now, not when friendship required more than fantasy football discussions and weekend barbecues. The evening light filtered through our kitchen window as I sat across from Sarah and our twins, trying to find words that didn't exist in any language for telling 8-year-olds that Mommy was sick and Daddy lost his job and we might have to move in with Grandma, watching their faces transform from confusion to fear to that terrible understanding that childhood sometimes ends in a single conversation. By midnight, I was sitting in the dark of our living room, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that felt like someone else's dream. The leather furniture we'd saved 2 years to buy, the family photos climbing the stairwell like a timeline of better days, the silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat asking questions I couldn't answer. Have you ever noticed how quiet a house becomes when hope leaves? Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of emptiness, as if even the walls know something fundamental has shifted in the atmosphere of your existence. I picked up my phone and scrolled through contacts, looking for someone to call, someone who might understand, someone who wouldn't treat my crisis like a contagious disease that might infect their comfortable lives. But each name felt like a door already closed, each relationship suddenly revealed as seasonal rather than eternal. The strange thing about losing everything in one day is how your mind keeps reaching for the switches of a life that no longer exists. I found myself planning tomorrow's meetings before remembering there was no office to drive to, thinking about weekend plans before remembering we couldn't afford to leave the house, calculating bills with money that existed only in yesterday's bank statements. Sarah had finally fallen asleep upstairs, exhausted by grief and medications, and I envied her ability to escape into unconsciousness while my mind raced through spreadsheets of disaster, trying to solve equations where every variable had turned negative overnight. I walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, staring at food we could no longer afford to replace, and something inside me broke in a way that felt irreparable, not dramatic, not cinematic, just the quiet snap of a spirit recognizing its own defeat. That's when I heard it. Not audibly, not like a voice you could record or replay, but unmistakably present in the space between one heartbeat and the next. My God, why have you forsaken me?" And I realized I wasn't the first person to ask that question in the darkness, wasn't the first to feel abandoned when life collapsed faster than faith could catch it. I'd been to church most Sundays, said prayers before meals, even taught Sunday school during the years when success made spirituality feel manageable. But this whisper in my kitchen felt different, dangerous, like an invitation to a conversation I'd been avoiding my entire adult life. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical lullaby, The dishwasher clicked through its cycles. The house settled into its foundation with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like breathing. And I stood there in my boxer shorts and yesterday's anxiety, wondering if God was someone you could call when your phone plan included unlimited desperation. What do you do when your entire identity evaporates in the span of daylight hours? I'd spent 20 years building a reputation, a career, a financial fortress that was supposed to protect my family from exactly this kind of catastrophe, and it had crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide, leaving me standing in the wreckage wondering who I was when stripped of titles and salaries and the comfortable illusion of control. The business cards in my wallet still read Senior Vice President, but they felt like artifacts from an archaeological dig, evidence of a civilization that had vanished overnight, and I found myself staring at my reflection in the dark kitchen window, trying to recognize the man who'd lost everything before breakfast was over. Sleep felt impossible, so I walked through our house like a ghost touring his former life, touching surfaces that would soon belong to someone else, memorizing details I'd been too busy to notice when they were permanent fixtures rather than temporary privileges. The family room where we'd watched 1,000 movies, the dining table where homework battles had been fought and won, the front porch where I'd taught the twins to ride bikes. Every space suddenly felt sacred and borrowed, like I was saying goodbye to a museum of my own happiness. I tried to pray, really pray, not the quick transactions I'd offered during traffic jams or before important meetings, but the kind of desperate communication that happens when you've run out of earthly solutions and heavenly interventions seemed like the only option left on a very short list. The words felt clumsy in my mouth, unpracticed, like trying to speak a language I'd studied in school but never used in real conversation, and I found myself apologizing to God for only calling when I needed something, like a friend who only shows up when he needs to borrow money. But in that apologetic fumbling, something shifted in the atmosphere of my desperation, not an answer exactly, more like the sensation of being heard by someone who'd been listening long before I'd started talking. And I felt the strangest thing, not peace, not comfort, but the presence of something larger than my circumstances, something that made the darkness feel less empty and the silence less condemning. 3 weeks had passed since the collapse, and I'd learned to function like a ghost in my own life, going through motions that felt scripted by someone else while my soul hibernated in a place too numb to feel the sharp edges of reality cutting through what remained of my hope. The alarm still went off at 6:30 a.m., muscle memory from a career that no longer existed, and I'd lie there listening to Sarah's labored breathing, counting the seconds between each inhale like a meditation on mortality, before forcing myself into a shower that felt like baptism in reverse, emerging not cleansed, but somehow more stained by the weight of another day I had to survive without purpose. Coffee tasted like burnt water, breakfast felt like swallowing cardboard, and conversations with the kids became exercises in acting normal while everything inside me screamed that normal had died in a hospital parking lot 21 days ago. Have you ever noticed how your body can keep living when your soul has gone into witness protection? I'd developed a routine of emotional anesthesia that would have impressed any trauma surgeon. Wake up, shower, dress in clothes that hung loose because stress had stolen my appetite, drive nowhere in particular while burning gas we couldn't afford, return home to play the role of husband and father while feeling like an understudy who'd never learned the lines. The pharmacy visits became weekly pilgrimages where I'd wait in fluorescent purgatory, watching other people collect prescriptions for ordinary ailments that could be cured with pills, envying their simple problems while clutching Sarah's cancer medications like rosary beads that offered no absolution. Job applications filled my days with the kind of hope that hurts worse than despair. Each rejection email arriving like a small death, each, "We've decided to go with another candidate," becoming another shovel of dirt on the grave of my professional identity, until I stopped checking email altogether because silence felt kinder than systematic destruction. The house had started showing signs of our new reality, grass growing longer between mowings we couldn't afford, paint peeling from window frames we couldn't repair, small breakdowns that felt like metaphors for everything else falling apart in slow motion. Friends had evolved from concerned to awkward to absent, their text messages growing shorter and less frequent until our phones became monuments to social entropy. And I realized that most relationships are built on the assumption of mutual prosperity rather than the promise of mutual presence. What they don't tell you about losing everything is how it reveals the architecture of your previous life, showing you which foundations were made of concrete and which were made of sand, which connections were welded and which were merely taped together with the adhesive of convenience. I'd started recognizing patterns that felt older than my current crisis, memories surfacing like archaeological discoveries from a childhood I'd spent decades trying to forget. My father disappearing during my mother's nervous breakdown, my grandfather vanishing when the factory closed. A generational pattern of men who ran when running felt easier than staying. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd built my entire adult life trying to become the opposite of men who'd abandoned their families, only to discover that success and failure were just different forms of the same disappearing act, different ways of not being present when presence was what mattered most. Sunday mornings had become the hardest part of the week because church felt like visiting a country where I no longer spoke the language, surrounded by people whose problems felt manageable and whose faith felt unexamined. And I'd sit in the back pew, listening to sermons about God's provision while staring at medical bills that suggested divine mathematics operated by different rules than earthly accountants. The hymns that once lifted my spirit now felt like accusations, songs about God's faithfulness, sung by people who'd never had their faith interrogated by stage 4 cancer and unemployment papers arriving on the same day. And I'd leave before the final blessing because I couldn't stomach another handshake from someone who'd ask how I was doing while hoping I wouldn't actually tell them. But something strange was happening in the spaces between my carefully constructed numbness, interruptions that felt too intentional to be coincidental, too specific to be random, like divine breadcrumbs scattered along the path of my destruction. The grocery store clerk who paid for our groceries when my card was declined, claiming her register had malfunctioned, but meeting my eyes with a knowledge. That transcended customer service training. The stranger in the unemployment office who left a $20 bill on my chair with a note that read, "For coffee and hope," signed only with a small cross that looked hand-drawn rather than printed. These moments felt like glitches in the matrix of my misery, small tears in the fabric of despair that let unexpected light leak through. And I found myself becoming a reluctant detective of divine intervention, cataloging instances that my rational mind dismissed as coincidence, while my desperate heart filed them under evidence of something larger than chance operating in my circumstances. Scripture verses started appearing in the strangest places. Psalm 34:18. On a billboard I'd driven past 100 times but never noticed, the same verse printed on a receipt from the pharmacy, overheard in a conversation between two elderly women in the hospital waiting room, like God was learning to text, but only knew one phone number and kept sending the same message. My dreams had become more vivid and strange, populated by conversations with people I couldn't identify, but who spoke with voices that felt familiar, conversations about endurance and purpose, and the difference between being abandoned and being prepared, conversations that felt more real than my waking hours and left me confused about which state of consciousness was the dream. Nature seemed to be trying to tell me secrets I wasn't ready to understand. The way morning light fell across Sarah's sleeping face like a benediction. How trees outside our bedroom window moved without wind. The cardinal that appeared every morning at the same time, sitting on the same branch, looking directly at me, with eyes that felt almost human in their intensity and intelligence. The kids had started asking different questions, not just about mommy's sickness or daddy's job, but deeper inquiries that felt like philosophy disguised as childhood curiosity. Why do bad things happen to good people? And does God still love us when we're sad? And will we still be a family if we don't have money? Questions that required answers I didn't possess but felt compelled to attempt, fumbling toward wisdom I didn't know I carried. Recovery groups had become my new social circle, rooms full of people whose losses made mine feel both smaller and larger simultaneously, where I learned that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a country to be inhabited, complete with its own language, customs, and time zones that operated independently of normal human chronology. These broken people taught me things that success had never whispered, how to sit with pain without trying to fix it, how to receive help without feeling diminished, how to speak truth without decoration or explanation, how to recognize that rock bottom was not a destination, but a foundation, the only place solid enough to support the weight of authentic reconstruction. There was Margaret, whose husband of 43 years had died in his sleep, leaving her to navigate a world she'd never learned to navigate alone, who taught me that widowhood and unemployment were different forms of the same amputation, the sudden absence of identity that had defined everything from morning routines to long-term planning. There was David, a veteran whose injuries had stolen not just his mobility but his sense of purpose, who spoke about phantom pain in terms that helped me understand that losing a career was its own form of phantom limb syndrome, reaching for abilities and identities that no longer existed but still ached with remembered presence. The counselor who led our group, Dr. Patricia Williams, had eyes that held stories she'd never tell but had clearly lived. And she taught us that healing was not about returning to who we were before trauma, but about becoming who we were meant to be after trauma, not restoration, but transformation, not recovery, but discovery of selves we'd never had courage to meet. It was during one of these group sessions, sitting in a circle of folding chairs in a church basement that smelled like coffee and confessions, that I felt the first crack in the emotional wall I'd built to protect myself from hope, because hope had become more dangerous than despair, requiring courage I wasn't sure I possessed and faith I wasn't sure I deserved. Margaret was talking about cleaning out her husband's closet, how his cologne still lingered on his shirts like a ghost that refused to leave, when something inside my chest began to thaw, not warmly, but with the painful tingling that happens when circulation returns to extremities that have been numb too long. I found myself crying for the first time since that morning in the hospital parking lot, not the dramatic sobs of cinema, but the quiet leak of a soul that had been holding back an ocean, and Dr. Williams handed me tissues while saying nothing, understanding that some tears need to fall in silence, witnessed but not interrupted. The drive home felt different that evening, like I was returning to the same house but with different eyes, and I caught myself noticing things I'd been too numb to see, the way late afternoon light transformed our neighborhood into something almost magical, how children's laughter from the park across the street sounded like music. I'd forgotten how to hear, the smell of someone's dinner cooking that reminded me food could be comfort instead of just fuel for survival. Sarah was awake when I got home, sitting in her chair by the window where she spent most afternoons now, reading a book about prayer that someone from church had brought. And when she looked up at me, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen in weeks. Not hope exactly, but the absence of the despair that had been our constant companion, a kind of peaceful acknowledgement that we were walking through something together rather than dying alone. 3 a.m. had become my witching hour, the time when sleep abandoned me to wrestle with questions that daylight made easier to avoid, and I found myself in our backyard, staring at stars that seemed indifferent to human suffering, their ancient light traveling millions of years just to illuminate my crisis with cosmic perspective that felt more insulting than comforting. The night air carried the scent of Mrs. Henderson's jasmine over the fence, a sweetness that felt obscene in the context of my bitterness, and I stood there in my pajamas and bare feet, feeling ridiculous and desperate and angry at a God who seemed to specialize in silence when his children needed answers most. "Where were you?" I whispered at first, then louder, then shouting at the darkness like a madman who'd lost his medication and found his voice. "Where were you when the doctor called? Where were you when they handed me that pink slip? Where were you when my best friend decided I was too much trouble to love?" The words came pouring out like poison I'd been swallowing for weeks, accusations and demands in the kind of raw honesty that only emerges in the space between midnight and dawn when pretense becomes too exhausting to maintain. Have you ever tried to fight someone who refuses to fight back? God's silence felt like cosmic passive aggression, the kind of treatment that drives you crazier than outright conflict, because at least conflict acknowledges your existence, validates your right to be angry, gives you something to push against instead of swinging at air that offers no resistance. I paced our small yard like a caged animal, kicking at the garden gnome Sarah had bought during happier times, ranting about fairness and justice and the fundamental cruelty of a universe that lets good people suffer while evil people prosper, building my case against divine benevolence with the passion of a prosecutor who'd been personally wounded by the defendant. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was arguing with someone I wasn't even sure existed, demanding answers from a God I'd spent most of my adult life treating like a cosmic emergency contact, someone to call only when all earthly options had been exhausted and desperation made atheism feel too expensive to maintain. But anger, I was discovering, was just grief wearing a Halloween costume, and underneath all my accusations was a broken heart that had been taught to express pain as rage because tenderness felt too dangerous for men who'd been raised to equate vulnerability with weakness. The bathroom mirror at 4 a.m. became my unwilling confessor, reflecting back a face I barely recognized, hollow cheeks where success used to live, eyes that had learned to hold too much sorrow, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile without conscious effort, and I found myself staring at this stranger, wondering when I'd started looking like my father during his worst years, the years when disappointment had carved permanent furrows in his forehead and taught his shoulders to carry weight they were never designed to bear. "Who are you?" I asked my reflection, not rhetorically, but desperately, because the man in the mirror wasn't the successful executive who'd had answers for everything, wasn't the confident husband who'd promised to protect his family from exactly this kind of catastrophe, wasn't the Sunday school teacher who'd spoken about God's faithfulness with the authority of someone who'd never had his faith interrogated by real crisis. This man in the mirror was someone I'd spent 43 years trying not to become, someone who looked suspiciously like the scared kid who'd hidden in his bedroom when his parents fought about money, who'd promised himself he'd never be poor or powerless or dependent on anyone for anything, who'd built an entire identity around never being vulnerable enough to get hurt this badly. But mirrors, I was learning, have a way of reflecting more than just physical appearance. They show you the architecture of your soul, the framework of fears and hopes and defense mechanisms you've constructed to protect the tender places that never quite heal from childhood wounds. I saw my father's eyes looking back at me, the same defeated expression he'd worn after the plant closed and he'd spent 18 months pretending to look for work while actually hiding in the garage, drinking beer and rebuilding engines that would never run because running required a destination he no longer believed existed. I saw my grandfather's slumped shoulders, the posture of a man who'd learned that the world was not safe for dreamers, that hope was a luxury poor people couldn't afford, that the best you could do was survive until you couldn't survive anymore and try not to. Take too many people down with you. These generational ghosts had been haunting my bloodline for decades, passing down their fear like an inheritance no one wanted but everyone received, and I realized I was standing at a crossroads where I could either repeat their pattern of quiet surrender or find a different way to be broken that didn't require disappearing from the people who needed me to stay. Scripture had been stalking me for weeks now, appearing in places that defied coincidence, and that morning Psalm 34:18 showed up written in steam on my shower door, which should have been impossible since I lived alone with my family and no one else had been in that bathroom. But there it was in perfectly formed letters that couldn't be explained by natural condensation patterns or my imagination working overtime in the service of desperate hope. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Words that felt like an invasion of my privacy and a validation of my pain simultaneously, like God was trying to have a conversation I'd been avoiding by staying busy with anger and self-pity. I traced the letters with my finger before the steam dissipated, memorizing each curve and line like evidence in a court case I was building against my own atheism. Because even if I couldn't believe in God's goodness, I was having trouble disbelieving in God's existence when the evidence kept mounting in ways that rational explanations couldn't quite accommodate. Fighting with God, I discovered, was different from fighting with humans because humans eventually get tired of your anger and walk away. But God seemed to have infinite patience for my rage, infinite capacity for absorbing my accusations without retaliating or defending himself or explaining his choices in ways that satisfied my human need for cosmic justice. It was like boxing with air, exhausting myself against an opponent who wouldn't engage on my terms but wouldn't abandon the ring either, who stayed present in my anger without being diminished by it, who seemed to understand that my fight was really with circumstances beyond anyone's control and pain that had nowhere else to go except up toward heaven, like smoke from a sacrifice I hadn't meant to make. The theological questions came flooding in like water through a broken dam. Why does God allow suffering? If He's all-powerful, why doesn't He stop cancer? If He's all-loving, why do children go hungry? If He's all-knowing, why did He create a world where good people get destroyed by forces beyond their control? These weren't academic inquiries anymore, but personal interrogations, cross-examinations of divine character that felt like life or death litigation, where my faith was both the plaintiff and the defendant. But in the space between questions and answers, something was shifting in the atmosphere of my desperation. Not comfort exactly, but presence, like discovering you're not alone in a room you thought was empty, like realizing someone has been listening to your complaints even when you thought you were talking to yourself. The divine response didn't come as a voice you could record or words you could quote, but as understanding that arrived like dawn, gradually illuminating things that had been hidden in darkness, helping me see that God's presence wasn't absence of pain, but presence within pain, not protection from suffering, but companionship through suffering, not explanation for crisis, but participation in crisis. I was there, something whispered in the space between heartbeats. In the doctor's gentle hands when he delivered hard news, in the stranger who paid for your groceries, in the $20 bill left by someone who understood your need, in the cardinal that visits your window, in the dreams that feel more real than waking, in the steam on your shower door, in the very tears you're crying now. This presence felt ancient and immediate, familiar and foreign, like recognizing someone you'd known your whole life but had never really seen clearly. And I understood that God's closeness to the brokenhearted wasn't metaphorical comfort, but literal geography, divine proximity that increased rather than decreased in proportion to human suffering. The surrender that came wasn't dramatic or cinematic, not the white flag of defeat, but the exhaled breath of someone who'd been holding their breath too long, the release that happens when fighting becomes more exhausting than accepting, when resistance costs more energy than submission, when you realize that what you've been wrestling against might actually be what you've been wrestling toward. I stopped demanding answers and started accepting mystery, stopped requiring explanations and started receiving presence, stopped insisting that God fix my circumstances and started allowing God to fix me within my circumstances, understanding for the first time that healing and curing were two completely different words that I'd been using interchangeably for most of my spiritual vocabulary. The stars looked different when viewed through tears of surrender rather than tears of rage, not brighter exactly, but more connected, part of a vast symphony where my small note of suffering was neither discordant nor insignificant, but harmonized with countless other notes of pain and hope and endurance that stretched across galaxies and generations, creating music. I was only beginning to learn how to hear. Walking back toward the house, I felt different. Not fixed but changed, not healed but healing, not answered but heard. And I understood that this was what prayer had always been supposed to be, not a transaction but a conversation, not a demand but a relationship, not a way to get what I wanted but a way to discover what I needed, which was not the removal of suffering but the presence of someone who suffered with me. The old shoebox under our bed had become an accidental time machine, filled with photographs and letters and ticket stubs from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. And as I sat surrounded by these artifacts of better days, something extraordinary began to happen. I started seeing God's fingerprints on moments I'd previously credited to luck, coincidence, or my own careful planning. The job at Morrison & Associates that I'd celebrated as my greatest achievement suddenly revealed itself as divine orchestration when I remembered how 3 other opportunities had fallen through at the last minute, doors that had slammed shut to redirect me toward a position that would teach me skills I didn't know I'd need, introduce me to people who would matter in ways I couldn't foresee, and place me in a building 2 blocks from the hospital where Sarah would eventually need treatment. Have you ever looked back at your life and realized that what felt like random events were actually breadcrumbs leading you exactly where you needed to be, even when where you needed to be wasn't where you wanted to go. The apartment we'd rented during our first year of marriage, the one I'd complained about because it was too small and too expensive, sat directly across from St. Mary's Medical Center, and now I understood why Sarah had insisted we stay there an extra 6 months despite finding a better place. Some part of her soul had been preparing for a future neither of us could imagine, learning the layout of hallways she'd walk during chemotherapy, memorizing the faces of nurses who would become her allies in a war we didn't know was coming. The financial advisor, who'd seemed overly cautious, insisting we maintain a larger emergency fund than I thought necessary, had been preparing us for an emergency that would consume every penny of that fund and more, his conservative advice becoming the difference between catastrophic loss and merely devastating loss, between losing our house in 3 months versus 6 months, between having no options and having terrible options that were still options nonetheless. The Sunday school class I'd taught for 5 years, the one that had forced me to study Scripture more deeply than I'd ever intended, had been divine boot camp for a crisis that would require every verse I'd memorized, every theological concept I'd wrestled with, every moment I'd spent learning to speak about faith in language that made sense to people who were hurting. My childhood came flooding back with new interpretation, memories I'd filed under abandonment and neglect suddenly revealing themselves as preservation and preparation when viewed through the lens of divine providence rather than human failure. The summer my father lost his job and we couldn't afford vacation, forcing us to explore every free museum and park within driving distance, had taught me how to find wonder without spending money, how to create joy from imagination rather than purchase it from catalogs, skills that were proving invaluable now that poverty was no longer theoretical but practical, daily, immediate. The grandmother who'd insisted on teaching me to cook despite my protests that cooking was women's work, who'd forced me to learn basic car maintenance and home repair, who'd made me memorize Bible verses I thought were pointless at the time, had been equipping me for a season when I'd need to stretch every dollar, fix everything myself, and find hope in ancient words that had sustained people through disasters much worse than mine. The moves we'd made as a family, the schools I'd attended, the friends I'd lost touch with and found again, the jobs that hadn't worked out, and the jobs that had... All of it began to look less like chaos and more like choreography, a dance whose steps I'd been learning without realizing there was music playing, without understanding that someone had been leading all along. Sarah's diagnosis, which had felt like cosmic cruelty, started revealing its own strange mercy when I remembered the insurance policy I'd almost canceled 6 months earlier, convinced we were paying for coverage we'd never need, only to have the HR director talk me out of it during a casual conversation that now felt like divine intervention, disguised as office small talk. The specialist Dr. Martinez had recommended, the one with the earliest available appointment, turned out to be the same doctor who'd treated my college roommate's mother 15 years ago, a connection that led to treatment options and clinical trials that wouldn't have been available through normal referral channels, doors that opened because of relationships I'd never thought to catalog as significant. The timing of my job loss, which had felt like the ultimate betrayal, suddenly made sense when I realized it freed me to be present for Sarah's treatment in ways that would have been impossible if I had still been working 80-hour weeks, chasing promotions that would have meant nothing if I'd missed her last months, because I was too busy being successful to be available for the success that actually mattered. Even the silence of friends that had felt like abandonment began to reveal its own peculiar blessing, when I understood that fair-weather relationships were being pruned away to make room for authentic connections, that some people had to leave my life to make space for the people who were meant to enter it. That loss was sometimes God's way of making room for better gifts that required empty hands to receive them. The recovery group, the counselor, the broken people who'd become my new community, none of these relationships would have been possible if my old life had remained intact, if success had continued to insulate me from the kind of authentic human connection that only happens when pretense becomes too exhausting to maintain and vulnerability becomes the only path toward healing. Margaret, the widow who'd taught me that grief was not a problem to be solved but a country to be inhabited, had lost her husband the same week I'd lost my job, divine timing that allowed us to walk through our different forms of devastation together, each of us becoming medicine for the other's wounds, in ways that individual suffering never could have accomplished. The cardinal that visited our window every morning wasn't just a bird, I realized, but a messenger carrying news from a kingdom where different rules applied, where love was stronger than cancer, where presence was more valuable than presence, where being was more important than doing, where identity was determined by whose you were rather than what you'd accomplished. The dreams that felt more real than waking life were actual conversations with the divine, not metaphorical comfort, but literal communication. From someone who'd been trying to get my attention for decades, but had finally found me quiet enough and desperate enough and broken enough to listen without the interference of my own plans and ambitions and carefully constructed defenses against mystery. The scripture appearing in impossible places wasn't coincidence, but correspondence. Love letters from someone who'd been writing to me my entire life, but had finally found me willing to open mail I'd been returning to sender, too busy with my own agenda to read messages from the one who'd been orchestrating my agenda all along. My name, I remembered, wasn't failure or unemployed or husband of cancer patient or any of the labels I'd been wearing like identity badges for the past 2 months. My name was beloved, chosen, son, words God had been calling me since before I was born, but that I'd been too successful to hear, too independent to need, too proud to receive, too busy building my own kingdom to notice I was already a citizen of a better one. The worth I'd been trying to earn through achievement had been freely given before I'd accomplished anything. Unconditional love that didn't fluctuate with my performance or bank account or professional status or ability to protect my family from suffering. Love that remained constant when everything else proved variable, foundational when everything else proved temporary, eternal when everything else proved mortal. This divine archaeology was revealing treasures buried in the rubble of my collapsed life, showing me that what I'd lost was never mine to begin with, and what I'd found was never mine to lose, that circumstances were just weather patterns in a climate controlled by someone who specialized in resurrection, who brought life from death and hope from despair and beauty from ashes with the casual confidence of someone who'd been in the resurrection business since before time began. The gratitude that came wasn't for my circumstances, but for God's presence within my circumstances, not for what was happening, but for who was walking through what was happening with me. Not for the storm, but for the companionship that made the storm bearable, survivable, even meaningful in ways I was only beginning to understand. I found myself whispering, "Thank you," into the darkness, not ironically but authentically, not for cancer or unemployment or financial ruin, but for the stripping away of everything false that had been preventing me from discovering what was true, for the removal of everything temporary that had been distracting me from what was eternal, for the loss of everything I thought I needed that was making room for everything I actually needed. This wasn't positive thinking or spiritual bypassing or any attempt to minimize the reality of suffering, but recognition that suffering could become sacred when surrendered to someone who specialized in transforming curse into blessing, who had a track record of bringing hope from hopelessness that stretched back through centuries of believers who discovered that rock bottom was the only foundation solid enough to support the weight of authentic faith. The worship that rose from my broken heart felt different from any praise I'd offered during prosperous times, not the grateful acknowledgement of a customer satisfied with divine service, but the desperate love of someone who'd been found by grace in places where grace wasn't supposed to exist, who'd been held by hands that had every right to let go but chose holding instead. 6 months later, I found myself sitting in the same hospital parking lot where this journey had begun, but everything was different, not the circumstances, which remained as challenging as ever, but the eyes I was using to see them, the heart I was using to feel them, the faith I was using to navigate them. Sarah's treatment was ongoing, a daily dance with hope and fear that would continue for months or maybe years, and my job search had yielded a position that paid half my previous salary, but somehow felt twice as meaningful because it aligned with who I was becoming rather than who I used to be. The financial stress remained real. The medical bills continued to arrive like unwelcome visitors, and uncertainty still colored most of our conversations about the future. But fear no longer occupied the driver's seat of my soul, because I'd learned to recognize God's presence in places I'd never thought to look for him before. Have you ever noticed how the same landscape can look completely different depending on the light you're viewing it through? The hospital that had once represented everything wrong with my world now felt like sacred ground where miracles happened daily, where people discovered strength they didn't know they possessed, where love revealed itself to be stronger than death and hope proved more durable than despair, where ordinary humans became warriors in battles they'd never asked to fight, but fought with courage that could only come from sources beyond themselves. The parking lot where I'd first heard God's whisper in my devastation had become my place of pilgrimage. Somewhere I returned when I needed to remember the transformation was not only possible, but inevitable for anyone willing to surrender their grip on how life was supposed to look and open their hands to receive how life actually was. The other patients and families moving through this space carried stories that made mine feel both unique and universal, each person fighting their own version of the battle I was learning to fight, each face reflecting some aspect of the journey from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance, and finally to something beyond acceptance that could only be called resurrection. My purpose had crystallized in ways I never could have imagined during my executive days, when success was measured in quarterly reports and annual bonuses that provided temporary satisfaction, but no lasting fulfillment. Now I found myself drawn to parking lots and waiting rooms, places where people sat in their own versions of rock bottom, wondering if anyone cared about their struggle, if anyone understood their fear, if God was real and present, or just a concept people discussed when life was manageable. These conversations happened naturally, without agenda or evangelistic pressure, just one broken person acknowledging another broken person's pain and sharing the truth that brokenness was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a different kind of story, one where scars became stars and wounds became windows through which divine light could shine into dark places. Margaret from the support group had become more than a friend. She'd become family, proof that God sometimes gives you the relationships you need exactly when you need them, and we'd started co-facilitating a new group for people navigating simultaneous crises, those facing multiple losses that compound and complicate grief in ways that single-issue support groups can't address. The kids had weathered this storm with resilience that amazed me, teaching me that children are naturally equipped for adaptability in ways that adults have to relearn, and their questions had evolved from fearful to philosophical to surprisingly wise, as if crisis had matured them in accelerated time, giving them access to truths that usually require decades to discover. They spoke about money differently now, understanding that wealth was not security and poverty was not failure, that family was not about what you could provide, but about how you chose to love each other. When providing became impossible, that happiness was not dependent on circumstances, but on how you decided to respond to circumstances beyond your control. Sarah's courage had become a daily sermon on faith in action, watching her face each treatment with grace that couldn't be manufactured or faked, only received from sources deeper than human willpower. And her peace in the face of uncertainty had taught me more about trusting God than any theology book or Sunday sermon ever could. She'd become beautiful in ways that transcended physical appearance, radiating something that made people stop and stare, not because of how she looked, but because of what she carried, some quality that could only be described as holy, as if suffering had burned away everything false and left only what was essential, eternal, true. The new job had introduced me to coworkers who knew nothing about my previous life, people who met me as I was becoming rather than as I used to be, and their acceptance of this simpler, more authentic version of myself had helped me understand that my identity crisis hadn't been about losing who I was, but about discovering who I'd always been underneath the roles and titles and expectations that had covered my true self, like makeup covers skin. working with people who were rebuilding their lives after various forms of disaster, unemployment, divorce, addiction, incarceration, illness, had shown me that my story was not unusual but universal, that everyone was carrying some form of invisible trauma, that healing was not a destination but a journey, that broken people helping other broken people was how the world actually worked when pretense was stripped away and authentic community was allowed to form. The pay cut that had initially felt like punishment now felt like liberation from the golden handcuffs of lifestyle inflation, freeing us to discover that happiness was not proportional to income, that contentment was possible at any economic level, that poverty could teach lessons about abundance that prosperity never could, that having less stuff meant having more time, more presence, more connection to what actually mattered. Prayer had become as natural as breathing, not because I'd become more religious, but because I'd learned to recognize that every moment was already a conversation with the divine, that God was not someone you called during emergencies, but someone who was present during ordinary moments, that worship was not something you did on Sundays, but something you lived on Tuesdays, that Scripture was not ancient text, but current communication from someone who was more interested in relationship than religion. The cardinal still visited our window every morning, but now I understood it was not a sign but a reminder, not divine communication, but divine companionship, not God sending messages, but God enjoying friendship, sitting with me in comfortable silence while I drank coffee and read verses that had become love letters rather than religious obligations. The wounded healer identity felt less like a role I was playing and more like a truth I was inhabiting, understanding that my qualifications for helping others were not my credentials, but my scars, not my education, but my experience, not what I knew, but what I'd survived, not my strength, but my willingness to admit weakness and find strength in places beyond myself. Each person I encountered who was facing their own version of losing everything became both my teacher and my student, someone I could learn from and someone I could serve. And I began to understand that ministry was not about having answers, but about being present, not about fixing problems, but about sharing burdens, not about preaching sermons, but about living testimonies. The ripple effects of transformation had begun extending beyond my immediate circle, touching people I'd never meet through conversations I'd never have, because authenticity is contagious in the same way that pretense is infectious, and broken people who have found healing carry something that gives other broken people permission to hope. Looking back at the man who'd sat in this same parking spot 6 months ago, I felt something that could only be described as compassion for his terror, understanding for his rage, and gratitude for his willingness to stay in the conversation even when the conversation felt impossible to survive. That man had been doing the best he could with the tools he had available, fighting battles he'd been trained to fight in ways he'd been taught to fight them, and his surrender had not been defeat, but graduation from one kind of life to another kind of life, from existence based on control to existence based on trust, from identity rooted in achievement to identity rooted in love. The sacred commissioning that was taking place in my heart felt both gentle and urgent, not a command from above, but an invitation from within, a recognition that my preservation through this storm had not been about my survival, but about my availability for the next person who would find themselves sitting in their own parking lot, wondering if anyone cared, if anyone understood, if God was real. I allowed everything false to fall away so you could discover what's unshakable, the familiar whisper reminded me. Your breaking was not your ending, but your becoming. Your loss was not your destruction, but your liberation. Your silence was not my absence, but my presence in a form you'd never learn to recognize. The commission was clear. Go sit with the broken and help them hear. My voice in the silence helped them understand that rock bottom is not the basement but the foundation, help them discover that what feels like abandonment is actually preparation for a kind of love they've never experienced but have always needed. Epilogue. 2 years have passed since I wrote these words, and I'm sitting in a different parking lot now, the community center where our support group has grown from 8 people to over 50. where Margaret and I have watched dozens of broken souls discover that their scars could become their credentials, their wounds could become their ministry, their testimony could become someone else's hope. Sarah's cancer is in remission, a word that means temporary retreat rather than permanent victory. But we've learned to celebrate temporary retreats as miraculous gifts rather than demanding permanent victories as our right. The kids are thriving in ways that prosperity never could have taught them, carrying wisdom about resilience and faith and family that will serve them for the rest of their lives, no matter what challenges they face. My income has actually increased as my dependence on income has decreased, not because I've returned to my old career, but because I've discovered that serving others with authenticity creates opportunities that serving yourself with ambition never could. The speaking engagements, the book contract, the consulting opportunities that have emerged from sharing my story were never goals, but have become byproducts of being willing to use my pain as medicine for other people's pain. But more than any external change, the internal transformation continues daily, not as dramatic revelation, but as quiet recognition that I am living a life I never could have planned, but wouldn't trade for any life I thought I wanted. The man who lost everything in one day discovered that everything he lost was preparing him for everything he was about to find, that his breaking was not the end of his story, but the beginning of his real story, that God's voice is often loudest in the silence, and God's presence is often strongest in the darkness, and God's love is often deepest in the places where human love has failed. If you're reading this from your own parking lot, your own moment of losing everything, your own silence where God seems absent, I want you to know that you are not alone, you are not forgotten, you are not abandoned, and your breaking is not your ending. The voice you're straining to hear is already speaking. The presence you're desperately seeking is already there. The love you're frantically searching for is already holding you, and the story you think is ending is actually just beginning. Your rock bottom is not your destination, but your foundation. And foundations are where the most beautiful buildings begin.